November 15, 1943, San Francisco Harbor, California. The iron shackles were still cold against his wrists when Sergeant Takeshi Yamada first saw the Golden Gate Bridge through the porthole of the transport ship. For 2 weeks, he had prepared himself for what imperial propaganda promised awaited Japanese prisoners in America. Labor camps worse than death, starvation, and brutal treatment at the hands of barbarians. What he saw instead would shatter everything he had been taught to believe. Behind him, 412 Japanese prisoners of war stood on the deck of the USS Henderson, squinting in the bright California sunlight after weeks in the ship's dark hold. They had been captured across the Pacific, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, the Gilbert Islands, and transported across an ocean to a country they had been trained to hate and fear. Now, as the ship moved slowly into the harbor, they witnessed something impossible.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you.
The city before them was not burning. It was not in ruins. It was thriving, untouched by war, its buildings rising like mountains of glass and steel against a blue sky. And the bridge, that magnificent red structure spanning the bay, stood as a monument to engineering that none of them had imagined possible in a nation they had been told was weak, decadent, and on the verge of collapse. Yamada was 27 years old, a career soldier who had enlisted in the Imperial Japanese Army at 18. He had fought in China, witnessed the fall of Singapore, and survived the hell of Guadalcanal before a piece of American shrapnel tore through his leg and left him unconscious in a shell crater. When he woke, he was in an American field hospital, his wound cleaned and bandaged, an IV drip in his arm. That had been his first confusion. He had been taught that Americans executed prisoners on sight. Instead, a Navy corpsman with red hair and freckles had changed his bandages twice daily, speaking to him in broken Japanese learned from a phrasebook. "You're going to be okay," the corpsman had said. "The leg will heal." Yamada had not believed him. He assumed it was a trick, that they were keeping him alive for interrogation or worse. But his days became weeks, and he was processed through a POW collection point in New Caledonia. No torture came. No interrogation beyond basic questions about his unit and rank. Just meals, medical care, and the long voyage to America. The other prisoners around him on the deck had similar stories. Corporal Hiroshi Tanaka, a 22-year-old from Osaka, had been pulled from the water off Tarawa after his transport was sunk. He had treaded water for 6 hours, certain he would drown before an American destroyer picked him up. The sailors had wrapped him in blankets, given him hot coffee, and treated his hypothermia. He had wept from shame, convinced he should have died rather than accept enemy mercy. Private First Class Kenji Watanabe, barely 19, had surrendered after his unit was surrounded on Guadalcanal. He had hidden his face in his hands, waiting for the bullet that never came. Instead, American Marines had given him water, checked him for weapons, and walked him to a rear position where other prisoners sat under guard, eating from metal trays.
"Look at that," Watanabe whispered now, pointing at the bridge. "How is it possible?" The radio said America was losing, that their cities were destroyed, that they had no resources left. Yamada said nothing. He was staring at the cars moving across the bridge in both directions. Hundreds of them. In Japan, gasoline was so scarce that most civilian vehicles had been converted to run on charcoal or had been confiscated by the military. Here, civilians drove freely, wasting fuel as if there were no war at all. An American guard noticed the prisoners staring. He walked over, his expression neutral, but not hostile. "First time seeing the gate?" he asked. When none of them responded, he tried again in halting Japanese. "Big bridge. Beautiful, yes?" Yamada found himself nodding before he could stop. The guard smiled slightly, then moved on to check on other prisoners. The ship docked at Fort Mason, where buses waited to transport the prisoners to their final destination, Camp Angel Island in San Francisco Bay.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
As they were led off the ship in columns of 4, Yamada studied everything. The docks were busy with activity, cargo being loaded and unloaded, workers moving with purpose, cranes lifting containers. There was no sign of shortages, no evidence of a nation struggling to survive. A forklift passed nearby, its operator whistling a tune Yamada didn't recognize. The machine was clean, well-maintained, painted a bright yellow. In the Japanese-occupied territories, equipment was breaking down constantly, parts were impossible to find, and machinery ran until it died. Here, even the industrial equipment looked new. The buses that transported them were civilian vehicles, requisitioned for military use, but still comfortable. Padded seats, windows that opened, and drivers who operated them smoothly. Yamada sat near a window watching the city pass by. Pedestrians on sidewalks carried shopping bags. Store windows displayed goods. A woman pushed a baby carriage while talking to a friend. Children played in a park. This was not a nation at war. Or if it was, the war had not touched it the way it had touched Japan. Beside him, Tanaka leaned close and whispered, "This cannot be real. It must be a specific district they show to prisoners, to break our spirit." Yamada wanted to believe that, but the scale of what he was seeing was too vast to be theater. The infrastructure, the vehicles, the casual abundance, it would require resources beyond measure to fake this convincingly. Camp Angel Island had been established as a POW facility in early 1943, built to house Japanese prisoners before their transfer to permanent camps inland. It sat on the north side of the island, overlooking the bay and the San Francisco skyline. When the buses arrived, the prisoners were unloaded and formed into ranks in a large assembly area. An American officer, a major in his 40s with graying hair, stood on a platform to address them. An interpreter, a Japanese-American soldier from the 442nd Regimental Combat Team's intelligence unit, stood beside him.
"I am Major William Harrison," the officer said, waiting for translation. "You are now prisoners of war under the custody of the United States Army. You will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. That means you will receive adequate food, shelter, medical care, and the right to correspond with your families through the International Red Cross." He paused, letting the interpreter catch up. "I know you've been told many things about what would happen if you were captured. I'm here to tell you that most of what you heard was false. You will not be executed. You will not be tortured. You will not be starved. You will be required to work, as the convention allows, but you will be paid for that work. You will be housed in barracks, fed 3 meals a day, and given access to medical care." Yamada listened to the translation, his mind rejecting the words even as he heard them. This had to be propaganda, designed to make them compliant. But as the major continued, describing the camp's layout, the daily routine, and the rules they would be expected to follow, the details were too mundane to be lies. "You will be assigned to barracks in groups of 40, Harrison said. Each barracks has beds, running water, and heating. You will be issued blankets, toiletries, and work clothes. Tomorrow, you will undergo medical examinations to ensure any injuries or illnesses are treated. Questions will be answered by your barracks leader, who will be selected from among your senior non-commissioned officers." The prisoners were divided by rank and unit, then led to their assigned barracks. Yamada's group was taken to Barracks 7, a long wooden structure with rows of bunk beds. The building was clean, painted white inside, with windows on both sides that let in natural light. At the end of the room sat a pot-bellied stove for heat, and beside it, stacks of firewood. Each bed had a mattress, 2 blankets, a pillow, and a footlocker. On top of each footlocker lay a care package, a bar of soap, a toothbrush and powder, a comb, a towel, and a set of work clothes. The prisoners stood in silence, staring at the accommodations. Finally, an older sergeant named Saburo Ishida spoke. "This is better than what we had in the barracks at Rabaul." It was true. The IJA barracks most of them had lived in before capture had been crowded, poorly ventilated, and infested with insects. This was clean, spacious, and equipped with amenities they had not expected. That evening, they received their first meal as prisoners. The food was brought to the barracks in large containers by American guards and served by the prisoners themselves onto metal trays. Rice, beef stew, bread, butter, canned peaches, and coffee. Yamada stared at his tray. The portion was larger than what Japanese soldiers received in active combat zones. The beef was real meat, not the dried fish or occasional chicken they had subsisted on. The bread was fresh, soft, and came with actual butter. The canned peaches were a luxury he had not seen since before the war. Around him, other prisoners ate slowly, suspiciously, as if the food might be poisoned or drugged. But hunger eventually overcame caution, and they ate. When they finished, there was more available. Seconds, thirds, if they wanted.
Watanabe, the young private, looked at Yamada with confusion in his eyes. "Sergeant, I don't understand. Where does all this food come from? Are they trying to fatten us for something?" Yamada had no answer. He had been trained in military logistics. He understood supply chains and resource management. What he was witnessing should not be possible for a nation supposedly struggling to fight a two-front war across 2 oceans. That night, lying in his bunk and staring at the ceiling, Yamada replayed everything he had been taught. America was weak, decadent, undisciplined. Its people were soft, unwilling to sacrifice. Its industrial capacity was exaggerated propaganda. Its military was poorly trained and equipped. Japan's spiritual superiority would overcome America's material advantages. But if that were true, how did this country have surplus food to feed prisoners better than Japan fed its own soldiers? How did it have gasoline to waste on civilian traffic? How did it build bridges that spanned impossible distances and cities that showed no scars of war? For the first time since his capture, Sergeant Takeshi Yamada allowed himself to consider a thought that bordered on treason. What if Japan could not win this war? The next morning, the prisoners underwent medical examinations. American doctors and medics moved through the barracks, checking each man for injuries, disease, and malnutrition. They worked efficiently but without cruelty, documenting conditions and prescribing treatment where needed. Yamada's leg wound was examined by a captain from the Army Medical Corps. The doctor unwrapped the bandage, studied the healing tissue, and nodded with approval. "Whoever treated this initially did good work," he said through the interpreter. "It's healing well, no infection. I'm going to give you exercises to restore flexibility and strength. Do them twice daily, and the limp should improve significantly." The doctor demonstrated the exercises, then had Yamada repeat them to ensure he understood. Before leaving, he handed Yamada a small tube of ointment. For the scar tissue, it'll help with the stiffness. After the examinations, the prisoners were given orientation lectures about camp rules and routines. They would work 6 days a week on various projects, farming, maintenance, construction, and would be paid 80 cents per day in camp scrip that could be used at the canteen for toiletries, snacks, and tobacco. The idea of being paid for work as a prisoner was so foreign that several men asked for clarification, certain they had misunderstood. But the interpreter confirmed it. The Geneva Convention required that POWs who worked be compensated, and the United States followed that rule.
On their third day at Angel Island, something happened that would fundamentally alter how the prisoners viewed their captivity. A delegation from the International Red Cross arrived to inspect the camp and interview prisoners about their treatment. The Red Cross representatives, Swiss nationals who served as neutral observers, met with groups of prisoners without American guards present. They asked direct questions. Were the prisoners being fed adequately? Were they receiving medical care? Had anyone been mistreated or abused? Yamada's group sat in a circle in their barracks with a Red Cross inspector, a middle-aged man named Klaus Hoffman, who spoke fluent Japanese. Hoffman listened as the prisoners described their capture, transport, and treatment at Angel Island. He took notes, asked follow-up questions, and showed no bias toward either side. "So you are saying the food is adequate?" Hoffman asked. "More than adequate," Sergeant Ishida admitted. "Better than what we received as soldiers." "And medical care?" "They treated my leg wound," Yamada said. "They gave me exercises to help it heal. They gave me medicine." Hoffman nodded, writing. "And have any of you been struck, threatened, or otherwise abused by guards?" The prisoners looked at each other. Finally, Corporal Tanaka spoke. "No, they do not hit us. They do not even shout at us unless we break a rule. It is strange." Hoffman smiled slightly. "Strange because it differs from what you expected?" "Yes." "What did you expect?" Silence. Then Watanabe, the youngest, answered honestly. "We expected to be killed or worked to death. We were told Americans show no mercy to prisoners." Hoffman set down his pen and looked at the young private with something like sadness. "I have inspected prisoner-of-war camps in many countries during this war. I can tell you that the treatment you are receiving here is consistent with international law. What you were told about American conduct toward prisoners was, I'm afraid, propaganda designed to make you fight harder and avoid surrender." The word hung in the air. Propaganda. Not truth, not reality. Propaganda. That evening, a fight broke out in Barracks 4 between two prisoners. One had suggested that perhaps Japan's leaders had lied about more than just how prisoners would be treated. The other had called him a traitor and attacked him. American guards broke up the fight quickly, separated the two men, and placed them in isolation for 24 hours to cool down. Neither was beaten, neither was punished beyond the temporary separation. The incident revealed a growing tension in the camp. Some prisoners clung desperately to their indoctrination, refusing to accept evidence that contradicted what they had been taught. Others, like Yamada, were beginning to question everything they thought they knew. A week after their arrival, the prisoners at Angel Island were given an unexpected privilege. They were allowed to write letters home through the Red Cross. The letters would be censored to remove military information, but personal messages would be delivered to their families in Japan. Yamada sat in the barracks with a pencil and paper, staring at the blank page. What could he write? That he was alive? That he was being treated well? That America was nothing like what they had been told? He began carefully, knowing censors would read every word. "Dear Mother, I am alive and uninjured, except for a leg wound that is healing well. I am being held as a prisoner of war in America. We are given food, shelter, and medical care. I am healthy. Please do not worry for me. I hope this letter finds you and Father well. Your son, Takeshi." He folded the letter, placed it in the envelope provided, and handed it to the barracks leader for collection. He did not know if his mother would ever receive it. He did not know if she was even alive. But writing it gave him a small sense of connection to a world that felt increasingly distant. That night, lying in his bunk, Yamada thought about the bridge. That impossible red bridge spanning the bay, carrying hundreds of cars in both directions. It had become a symbol in his mind of something larger, the vast gulf between what Japan had told its soldiers and what was actually true. He thought about the factories he had glimpsed from the bus, the stores full of goods, the civilians going about their lives as if war were something happening far away.
He thought about the food, the medicine, the casual abundance of resources that suggested an economy operating at a level Japan could never match. And he thought about his own government, which had sent him to fight a war against an enemy it had systematically lied about. An enemy that was not weak, not collapsing, not running out of resources. An enemy that could feed its prisoners better than Japan fed its own soldiers. For Sergeant Takeshi Yamada, standing on the deck of that transport ship and seeing the Golden Gate Bridge had been more than a shocking sight. It had been the beginning of a long, painful process of understanding that everything he had believed about this war, about America, and about his own country's chances of victory had been a carefully constructed lie. The war would continue for another 2 years, but for the 412 men who arrived at Angel Island that November day, the illusion had already shattered. They had seen America with their own eyes, and what they saw could never be unseen.
The repatriation ships began arriving in Japanese ports throughout the summer of 1946. Yamada's vessel, a converted Liberty ship named the SS Marine Phoenix, carried 847 former prisoners from camps across the American Midwest. The voyage across the Pacific took 3 weeks, following the same route Yamada had traveled in the opposite direction nearly 3 years earlier. But this time, he was not shackled. He was not confined to a hold. He stood on deck with other repatriates, watching the ocean pass, trying to prepare himself for what awaited in a Japan he no longer recognized. The conversations on the ship revealed a common thread among the returning prisoners. Nearly all had experienced the same cognitive dissonance between propaganda and reality. They had been told America was weak, collapsing, desperate. Instead, they had witnessed a nation operating with casual efficiency that suggested reserves of strength Japan had never possessed. "I worked in a lumber camp in Oregon," said one former private. "We cut trees for a single month that produced more timber than entire Japanese provinces harvested in a year. The machinery alone, one American steam donkey could do the work of 200 men, and they had dozens of them." Another man, a former corporal who had worked in agriculture near Fresno, California, described irrigation systems that transformed desert into farmland. They moved water hundreds of miles through concrete channels. Mountains were not obstacles, they built tunnels through them. Rivers were not barriers, they dammed them and redirected the flow. The scale of engineering was beyond anything I had imagined possible. Yamada listened but contributed little. His own revelations had been less about specific projects and more about systemic abundance. The way food appeared in quantities that suggested surplus was the default condition. The way equipment was maintained and replaced rather than repaired indefinitely. The way even prisoners received medical care that surpassed what Japanese soldiers had been given in active service. As the ship approached Yokohama in mid-July, silence fell over the deck. The men lined the railings, staring at what remained of one of Japan's greatest port cities. Entire districts had been erased. The waterfront infrastructure was partially reconstructed by American engineers, but beyond the functional port facilities lay block after block of ruins. Yamada thought of San Francisco, pristine and untouched, its bridges spanning impossible distances, its buildings reaching toward the sky. That was what a nation looked like when war happened somewhere else. This devastation before him was what defeat looked like when the war came home. The disembarkation process was managed by American occupation forces working with Japanese civilian administrators. Each returning prisoner was documented, given a small stipend in newly issued currency, and provided with information about relief services. They were also required to sign statements acknowledging they had been treated according to international standards during captivity.
Yamada signed without hesitation. It was the truth. Whatever else could be said about his years as a prisoner, he had been treated humanely by an enemy that had no obligation to show him mercy. The journey from Yokohama to Tokyo took most of a day, traveling through a landscape of destruction punctuated by makeshift settlements. People lived in shelters constructed from salvaged materials. Children played in rubble-strewn lots that had once been neighborhoods. Everywhere the population looked thin, worn, surviving rather than living. When Yamada finally reached his family's district, he was shocked to find their house still standing, though damaged. The roof had partially collapsed during a bombing raid, later repaired with mismatched materials. The windows were covered with paper rather than glass. But the structure remained, and inside, his mother was alive. The reunion was overwhelming. His mother, now 56, looked a decade older. Years of malnutrition and stress had aged her dramatically. His father, 61, had survived but lost most of his hearing during an air raid. They wept when they saw him, clutching him as if he might disappear again. That evening, sitting in their damaged home by lamplight, electricity was unreliable. Yamada learned what the war years had been like for Japanese civilians. The rationing that had reduced families to near starvation. The firebombings that had killed hundreds of thousands. The atomic weapons that had ended the war with incomprehensible destruction. The shame of defeat after years of being told victory was certain. His mother brought out his letters, all 7 that had been delivered through the Red Cross. She had kept them in a metal box, protected through evacuations and air raids. They were her proof that her son had survived when so many others had not. "You wrote that the Americans fed you well," she said quietly. "We did not believe it. We thought it must be a lie they made you write. But you were telling the truth?" "Yes, I was telling the truth." His father leaned forward. "Tell us everything, what you saw, what you learned." So Yamada told them about the Golden Gate Bridge and the cities untouched by war, about the farms producing surplus and the factories running at capacity, about the casual abundance that suggested America had fought the war at perhaps half its industrial potential, about the treatment prisoners received, adequate food, medical care, payment for labor. When he finished, his father sat back with a heavy sigh. "We were told we were winning until the very end. Even after the atomic bombs, some officials insisted we could still achieve a negotiated peace. They lied to us about everything." In the weeks that followed, Yamada tried to find work in a city where employment was scarce and economic chaos was normal. His military background was a liability rather than an asset. Former Imperial Army soldiers were viewed with suspicion by occupation authorities and with mixed feelings by civilians who blamed the military for the disaster.
He eventually found work with a Japanese contractor hired by American engineers to rebuild infrastructure. The irony was not lost on him. He was now being paid by the same military that had held him prisoner, doing construction work in his own devastated country while foreigners supervised the reconstruction. But the work brought him into contact with American personnel, and he discovered that the professionalism he had witnessed in prison camps extended to the occupation. The Americans were not conquerors in the traditional sense, looting, raping, imposing arbitrary rule. They were administrators implementing policy, bringing resources, and genuinely attempting to rebuild Japan as a functioning democracy. It was disorienting. Yamada had been raised in a military culture where defeated enemies were subjugated and humiliated. The Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere had been built on such subjugation, conquered territories exploited for Japanese benefit. But the Americans operated differently. They brought food aid, medical supplies, and technical expertise. They were reforming Japanese institutions rather than simply extracting resources. One afternoon in September, while working on a bridge reconstruction project, Yamada was approached by an American officer conducting a survey of former POWs. The officer, a captain named David Morrison,
spoke some Japanese, and was documenting prisoner experiences for a military history project. "I see from your records you were at Camp McCoy," Morrison said. "Can I ask you a few questions about your experience there?" Yamada agreed, and over the next hour he answered questions about his capture, transport, imprisonment, and repatriation. Morrison took detailed notes, asking about conditions, treatment, work assignments, and interactions with guards. At the end of the interview, Morrison asked an unexpected question. "Looking back now, knowing how the war ended, do you think your treatment as a prisoner affected your view of America?" Yamada considered carefully before answering. "Yes. When I was captured, I believed I would be killed or tortured. I had been taught that Americans were barbaric. Instead, I received medical care for my wounds, I was given food, shelter, and treated according to international law. It did not make me love America, but it made me question everything my government had told me." Morrison nodded, writing, "And now, seeing the occupation, how do you feel?" "Confused," Yamada admitted. "Japan conquered territories and ruled them harshly. We took resources and gave little back. But America defeats us completely and then helps rebuild what it destroyed. I do not understand the strategy. What does America gain from this?" Morrison smiled slightly. "Maybe that's the point. Maybe the strategy is to show that there's a different way to win a war, by making defeated enemies into future partners rather than permanent enemies. At least that's what the policy says." The conversation stayed with Yamada through the autumn months as he watched the occupation unfold. American food aid prevented mass starvation during the difficult winter of 1946-47. Medical teams combated disease outbreaks. Engineers rebuilt essential infrastructure. Educational reforms began transforming the school system. It was not purely altruistic. America clearly had strategic interests in creating a stable, democratic Japan as a Pacific ally. But the methods were fundamentally different from Japanese imperialism, and Yamada could not help but see the parallel to his own prisoner experience. Defeated enemies treated not as subjects to be exploited, but as human beings to be rehabilitated. By 1948, Japan was beginning to stabilize. The economy remained weak, but food shortages had eased and reconstruction was visible across major cities. Yamada had steady work and had managed to help his parents repair their home more permanently. Life was hard, but survivable. That spring, he encountered someone unexpected at a work site near Yokohama, Corporal Tanaka, his fellow prisoner from Camp McCoy. They had last seen each other during the repatriation voyage and had lost contact in the chaos of return. Tanaka was working for a different contractor, but on the same bridge project. During their lunch break, they sat on steel beams overlooking the harbor and talked about their experiences since returning. "Do you ever think about the bridge?" Tanaka asked suddenly. "The Golden Gate Bridge?" "Every day," Yamada admitted. That moment, seeing it for the first time, changed everything for me. It was the beginning of understanding how completely we had been deceived. Tanaka nodded. "I think about the food, how they fed us better than our own army fed its soldiers. That was when I knew Japan could not win. A nation that can afford to feed its prisoners abundantly while fighting on two fronts across two oceans. How do you defeat that?" They sat in silence, watching ships move through the harbor. American vessels, Japanese fishing boats, and commercial traffic beginning to return as trade restrictions eased. The harbor was slowly coming back to life. We were taught that surrender was the worst dishonor, that death was preferable to captivity. But I survived because I surrendered. If I had followed my training and fought to the death on Tarawa, I would have died for nothing. Instead, I lived, and now I can help rebuild what the war destroyed. Yamada understood. The shame of surrender had been intense, particularly in the early months of captivity. But time and experience had reframed that shame. Thousands of Japanese soldiers who had chosen death over surrender had died believing lies about enemy barbarism. Those who had surrendered and survived now had the opportunity to build something new from the ruins. In 1950, Yamada was offered a position as a liaison between Japanese construction firms and American military engineers. His English, learned in prison camp classes, and his understanding of both Japanese and American work cultures made him valuable. The pay was better than manual labor, and the work was less physically demanding. The position brought him into regular contact with American personnel, and he observed the same professionalism and efficiency he had witnessed at Camp McCoy. It was a management culture fundamentally different from the hierarchical, personality-driven system he had known in the Imperial Army.
One of the American engineers, a major named Robert Chen, whose parents had immigrated from China, noticed Yamada's thoughtful observations and began asking his opinions on various projects. During one conversation, Chen asked directly, "You were a prisoner of war in America. Does that make this work difficult for you, working with former enemies?" Yamada considered the question carefully. "At first, yes, but I came to understand that soldiers follow orders, and most Americans I met were simply doing their jobs, trying to be fair. The hatred I felt was never personal. It was taught. When I saw that Americans could be professional and humane, the taught hatred became difficult to sustain." Chen nodded thoughtfully. "War makes enemies of people who might otherwise have lived peacefully. The goal now is to prove that former enemies can become partners. That's the experiment we're all part of." By 1952, Japan's economy was beginning to recover more substantially. American aid programs were transitioning to trade relationships. The occupation was preparing to end formally, though American military presence would continue under mutual security agreements. The country was being transformed politically, economically, and socially. Yamada, now 36, had married and started a family. His wife, Akiko, was a war widow whose first husband had died in the Philippines. They had a daughter, Yuki. One evening, Akiko asked him about his war experience. He knew he'd been captured and imprisoned in America, but he had shared few details. Now, with their daughter asleep and the house quiet, he told her the full story. He described the moment seeing the Golden Gate Bridge and the realization that followed. The abundance at Camp McCoy that contradicted every propaganda message. The professionalism of American guards and administrators. The Red Cross inspections that verified prisoners were being treated humanely. The journey across America that revealed industrial and agricultural capacity on a scale Japan could never match. When he finished, Akiko was quiet for a long moment. "You're saying Japan never had a chance to win?" "No, not against America's actual strength. We were fighting an image, a propaganda creation. The real America was something entirely different, stronger, wealthier, more organized than anything our leadership acknowledged. They sent us to fight a war they knew, or should have known, was unwinnable. And yet you're helping them now, rebuilding Japan with American assistance. Because the alternative is to hold on to hatred and bitterness while living in ruins. Japan made catastrophic mistakes. We can acknowledge that and try to build something better, or we can cling to failed ideas and remain defeated. I choose to build." In 1955, Yamada received an unexpected letter from America. It was from Staff Sergeant Roy Henderson, the cook from Camp McCoy, who had explained American agricultural surplus to him 12 years earlier. Henderson had tracked him down through military liaison offices and wanted to know how his former prisoner was faring.
The letter was friendly, asking about Yamada's family and work, sharing updates about Henderson's own life. He had returned to his farm in Iowa, married, had 3 children, and was doing well. He mentioned that he sometimes thought about the Japanese prisoners he had worked with and hoped they had survived the war's aftermath. Yamada replied, writing carefully in English, describing his life in rebuilt Japan, his family, and his work helping reconstruct the country.
He thanked Henderson for his kindness during the prison years and acknowledged that the treatment he had received had fundamentally changed his understanding of both America and his own nation. The correspondence continued sporadically over the years. Henderson sent photographs of his farm, his children, the Iowa landscape. Yamada sent pictures of his growing family and the reconstructed Tokyo skyline. They never discussed politics or the war's rights and wrongs. They simply maintained a connection between two men who had met as enemy and prisoner, but had recognized each other's humanity. In 1963, Yamada's daughter Yuki was studying English in school and asked her father why he spoke the language so fluently. He told her about Camp McCoy, about the English classes taught by American guards and Nisei interpreters, about learning the language as a prisoner. "Were you afraid?" she asked. "When you were captured?" "Terrified," he admitted. "I thought I would be killed. But instead, I was shown that enemies could be honorable, that defeat did not have to mean destruction, and that human beings from different nations could treat each other with basic dignity even during war." Is that why you work with Americans now? Partly, but also because the alternative is to let bitterness poison the future. Japan and America were enemies. Many died on both sides. But the war ended, and we had to choose what came next. Some chose to hold on to hatred. I chose to build something new. By the 1970s, Japan had become an economic power, its cities rebuilt and modernized, its industries competitive globally. The relationship with America had evolved into a complex alliance defined by mutual economic interest and strategic partnership. The war that had devastated both nations had become history, studied in schools, but increasingly distant from daily life. Yamada, now in his 50s, had risen to a senior position in his construction company. He had worked on major projects across Japan and occasionally traveled to America for business. On one such trip in 1976, his work brought him to San Francisco. He stood at the same spot where he had first glimpsed the Golden Gate Bridge 33 years earlier, though from land rather than sea this time. The bridge remained magnificent, its red towers spanning the bay exactly as they had in 1943. But his perspective had changed entirely. Then he had been a defeated prisoner, seeing evidence that shattered his worldview. Now he was a business executive from an allied nation, traveling freely, negotiating contracts, participating in the economic relationship between former enemies turned partners. He thought about how far both he and his nation had traveled since that November day in 1943. The journey from enemy prisoner to economic partner had been long, painful, and transformative. But it had been possible because, at crucial moments, people on both sides had chosen to see beyond propaganda, to recognize shared humanity, and to build rather than destroy. When Yamada returned to Japan after that business trip, his daughter Yuki, now an adult herself with a young child, asked if seeing San Francisco again had been difficult. "No," he said. "It was clarifying. The bridge that once showed me Japan's defeat now represents something else. The possibility that former enemies can become partners, that war's hatred can transform into peace's cooperation, and that the future doesn't have to be defined by the past." He held his granddaughter, a child who would grow up in a Japan unimaginable to the soldier who had been captured on Guadalcanal in 1943. She would never know hunger, occupation, or the desperation of total war. She would grow up in a peaceful, prosperous nation, allied with its former enemy. That transformation, Yamada believed, had begun with small moments of humanity during the war's darkest days. American medics treating enemy wounded, guards showing respect to prisoners, cooks explaining agricultural surplus to captured soldiers. Those moments had planted seeds that grew into the peace that followed. The Golden Gate Bridge had been his first glimpse of truth beyond propaganda. But the real lesson had taken decades to fully understand. That nations, like individuals, could learn from catastrophic mistakes, acknowledge uncomfortable realities, and choose better paths forward. The bridge remained a symbol, but its meaning had evolved from evidence of defeat into a monument to the possibility of transformation.